Thank you.
Okay,
See you all next Wednesday.
thank you. All right. All right, so you're Tony?
Yes, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm Judith. Hi. See if I
Hi.
can get some other people on here, whatever. Okay, no, that's not participants. That's, oh, okay. It's small. Where's the gallery view? All right, here it is. Different machines, different. All right, got it. Okay. Hey, Mary.
Hello.
Hi.
Whoever said that.
Yeah, hey, it's Judith.
Oh, hi, Judith.
Hi. Dale. Hi.
Anybody anxious to see my town tonight? Anybody want to know what Salt
Oh.
Lake really looks like?
Are we gonna really see it?
Well, you'll see the outside. It's awfully
Okay.
smoky, so you won't be
Ah.
seeing the mountains.
Are you in Salt Lake, Utah?
Yeah,
Wow, okay, I'm in Florida.
yeah. That's why I'm eating lunch.
I'm in
We think it's noon here.
Oh, good, good.
Where in Florida, Tony?
St. Augustine, it's in Northeast, just south of Jacksonville. I used to live in off of Aho Road in Boone.
Yeah, I used to live over by Samaritan's Purse. Rumor has it that Franklin was at that Rose Garden party.
Oh, I'm sure he was.
I'll end my comment there, but
That's okay.
who are we waiting for? The hostess, I suppose.
Yeah, Linda's not here.
Oh,
Where is
all right.
she?
So, Ellen, what's our next book? Oops, Ellen just went away.
The next book in our book group,
Yeah.
where most people are reading Pat's new book, From Kathmandu to Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
And several people are also, or instead of, reading Migrations.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think Migrations cost a lot less. No offense to Pat. I did look that one up.
Pat will send you a copy for $20, half price.
Yeah, but I can't read the book, so.
Oh, true. And there won't be an audio book of that. But I think there is one of Migrations, and it is a pretty gripping book.
Yeah, I've heard it's humorous. I hope.
No, it is
Never
not
mind.
humorous.
I don't want humor.
Not
Forget that.
humorous.
Okay.
Not humorous. Do you think Linda had any trouble getting into this meeting?
What's Linda's last name?
Jensen.
Oh,
There she is.
Hello, yes.
There
there
she
she is.
I started up my computer 15 minutes ago and I got an error message and it shut down the whole computer. And now everything is so sluggish. So here I finally am. Yeah, hi. Okay. Let's see. I'm gonna change my view of everyone. And
You know, everyone should mute themselves too. Except you. I mean,
oh,
don't you think?
Yeah.
okay,
Yes.
yeah. And then we'll be ready to get started. Cheryl Clausen has that lovely window in the background.
Linda, do you have a lot of light on your face? Because we can't see your face.
I have the only light I'm capable of having. I also
Okay.
have a burned out light bulb right now.
Okay.
It was a
I mean,
great start to the day.
less light would help on your face.
Oh, less light.
Yeah,
The
not the light
problem,
behind you.
yeah,
I think
can't
it's
do
because she's
anything about the
back.
angle of the sun.
Yeah, well, if you know, if you can't fix
Let's
that,
There, that's
really,
a little better. Yes.
Is
that's
that better?
that's a little better.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's even with a curtain over it, believe it or not. It's shining that bright through the curtain. Any other requests? Okay, let's get going. And I am so sorry about my slightly malfunctioning computer. Let's see, need to share screen and get Zoom going. And put that on slideshow. Why is it not going to slideshow? Okay, there we are. Okay, so today's reading is chapter 2 in A Paradise Built in Hell, and it's about the Halifax disaster. And I apologize about my images. There just aren't any good pictures from the Halifax disaster. It's almost a decade, it is a decade after the San Francisco earthquake, but I guess the city was so devastated, they didn't have a lot of photographers with cameras left. So this pile of debris, that's pretty much what the entire city looked like, with a few frames of a few structures remaining. There wasn't much left. So a smaller ship called the IMO hit a massive munition ship called Mont Blanc, and it burned. And then it exploded. And the 6 million pound ship lifted into the air. It was heard 200 miles away. It caused a black benzol rain that coated everything with essentially a petroleum-based soot. And it caused a 60-foot tsunami. So things that got blown up then got washed away and swirled by the water. And the firestorm, the fireball from the thing was a mile radius. 325 acres burned. Only 1,500 people were killed. Only 9,000 were wounded. And then a blizzard followed while they were still digging people out of the ruins. And interestingly enough, they weren't just digging them out of the ruins, they were getting them down from trees and the tops of power poles, and the tops of demolished buildings had live people blasted into them. And some people were blasted an entire mile. And a few of those who were blasted that far lived. This was an incredible event, except I'm sure you've seen the recent images of Beirut. It's a little hard to compare the contents of the munition ship that essentially had, I believe, 3,500 pounds of explosives, with Beirut that had 300,000 pounds of fertilizer that went bad and turned into explosives. So Beirut was clearly a lot worse, also much more densely populated. So, as we should expect, there was lots of altruism. The sailors fleeing the ship, who were really the only people who had any warning, that knew, they had an idea of what was going to happen. They got into lifeboats, paddled like crazy, and they landed at the Micmac Indian village across the river from the city of Halifax. And they grabbed little children as they ran, screaming in various foreign languages that the Micmac Indians didn't understand, to run. And most of the Indians got the idea and did run. A lot of children survived because instead of a mom trying to carry the weight of a couple of very small kids, sailors picked up the small kids and ran with them. Now, by doing that, they reduced their own chance of survival because they slowed themselves down with the extra weight. But apparently, few of them hesitated to grab a child as they ran. And then, of course, people dug one another out, and as I said already, got one another down. A grocery warehouse that survived pretty well intact, at least the contents were intact, if not all of the windows or the walls of the building. And they distributed all of the food they had over the next couple days. An operator stayed behind, a radio or a telephone operator. Back then, you couldn't just dial somebody in a foreign country. You literally had to have somebody at a phone office plug in different wires to physically create your long distance connection. And they stayed behind to do that because they knew that they were going to need help from far away. An arriving train that got there right after the explosion, they saw the explosion from the distance. They continued coming into the city, and then they became a hospital train carrying people away to nearby cities, and they had to go to more than one to get enough hospital beds for all the people who needed them. The government, what was left of it, and not everybody in government survived, but there were enough government officials to contact government officials elsewhere. It ran smoothly. Since they weren't just observers from on high, but were obviously part of the disaster along with everybody else, their homes were gone, their offices were gone, some of their families were gone. This was a rare one where it really did level the elite, and they did everything. They did not go into elite panic, which you're going to learn more about later. They did not. They did everything they could. They didn't obstruct. They didn't create ridiculous rules, although there was an order for the soldiers to shoot looters. These soldiers, unlike the soldiers in San Francisco, shot absolutely no one. The soldiers joined in and did what they could to help. The nearby countryside took in survivors, and those people were homeless and needed sheltering and feeding for months. Their jobs were gone. They couldn't pay for any of it. And people in the nearby countryside and the small towns and the farms took them in for months. Now, this chapter starts the theoretical perspective of the books. And I love this book because she does an incredibly good job of introducing sociologists and a few anthropologists and a historian or two and their theories without interrupting the flow of, this is a really dramatic story that she's telling. She manages to make the researchers part of the story. So we have Reverend Samuel Prince, and he had been one of the locals in Halifax, who had taken in survivors from the Titanic and also went out in small boats and ships to search for bodies from the Titanic. Most people froze to death, and that meant that they floated for a while rather than drowning in the depths. And he was one of the people. He housed Titanic survivors in his church. That's the main point where the movie The Titanic, which is incredibly accurate because the writer, director, project head, producer who created the film The Titanic, the famous one, was excavating the ruins of the ship under the ocean and essentially made the movie to fund the archaeological excavation of the ship. So it was physically accurate. We have so many reports from the Titanic. Just about everybody who survived got interviewed, and their interviews were recorded and circulated. So we know a lot about what happened on the Titanic. And the one point where the film chose to be intentionally inaccurate was when they have them land right away in New York. They didn't land right away in New York. They were all taken to Halifax, where many of them stayed for days, some stayed for weeks. So anyway, Samuel Prince was an active participant in these two major survivors. His church took in hundreds and fed thousands of people over the next several weeks after the disaster. But then he had noticed so much fascinating stuff and he wanted to understand it more. He went to university to get a degree in sociology. And he used his experiences in the disaster to write his dissertation. And he became one of the early major theorists of what do people do in times of disaster. Now, prior to that time, there was a strong belief that people would revert to barbarism, turn to animals fighting for survival, that the weak and vulnerable and little children would be killed by the adult males. Oh my God, the expectations that they had. And he noted that none of what sociological theory predicted happened in his disaster. Those who were most free of social bonds, the people you might have expected, and we even have some good evidence of that, you might have expected the visiting soldiers and the sailors, and I mean, nobody can trust a teenager in any culture at any time. You would have expected them to be the ones doing the looting and becoming the most barbaric. And unlike in San Francisco, they were the greatest help because they were free to help strangers. They didn't have family to care for, so they were able to dedicate all of their waking moments to helping the other people. That's an important point. We need to figure out, when do the incoming soldiers and people from the Red Cross and the other disaster agencies, when do they help the most? And when, because they're strangers, do they not care and then become part of the problem. But he points out in his disaster, those free of social bonds were the greatest help of all. He points out that everyone took on new roles, and in particular, he noted constant violation of gender roles. You know, women were digging people out of the wreckage. Women were acting like small-time engineers and pulling down a wall of a building away from an area where they thought that someone was trapped. They were working through engineering problems in their heads. They became the conductors on the train instead of just the nurses. Goodness, they should be nursing people, not telling people on a train where to go. But they were, all kinds of gender roles were being violated from that time's ideas. And, you know, he pointed out that vets became doctors. Doctors who were usually delivering babies suddenly became eye surgeons, and people did well. They were very successful in their new roles. So we've noticed that one in other disasters too. He wrote it down for the first time in a sociological analysis of disaster. And even more surprisingly, for that day in particular, the changes lasted. People, there was greater charity. Here he is, he's the reverend at a church, and he discovers that for the rest of his career as a reverend, people are more charitable and generous as a result of having gone through this together. There were new harbor safety rules. Laws got passed. There were improvements in how houses were constructed, not just laws being passed, but actual voluntary practices on the part of people building houses to make them more able to, you know, at least a mile from the blast zone, be able to stand through being on the periphery of the blast. Public health organization was enhanced. You had more departments created for public health, more funding for public health, more people working in the field of public health. And it wasn't just locally, but it was a wake-up call for Canada as well. And there were medical advancements. There were so many people who had shrapnel in their eyes that the doctors who did surgery to try and keep them from going blind had to try new things. I mean, you know, these are field emergency conditions. They had some good ideas that you never would have experimented on somebody with under other circumstances. They tried out their new ideas and they turned out to be good ideas. Medical science, particularly when it came to the eye, was advanced because of the Halifax disaster. And the courage to experiment that people are released into in the paradise built in hell. Reverend Prince initiated an argument with the theories of a very popular sociological book of that era, a little over, well, not that much over 100 years ago, 103 years ago. Most sociologists were reading and taking notes and quoting and trying to find further proof of a book called The Crowd. The theorist was a Frenchman named Leblanc, and it's the theoretical origin of the disaster expectation that people revert to barbarism. It wasn't so much based on a really good study of major disasters. It was primarily based on behavior in the French Revolution, which a revolution is disastrous, but it's a little different than an accidental disaster. He also studied recent earthquake in Kanto, Japan. And in that particular earthquake, the Japanese slaughtered, killed, tortured, hacked to pieces 6,000 Koreans living in Japan, not just in the immediate area of the earthquake, but in other parts of Japan as well. They were brutally massacred because the earthquake caused the water table in the city of Kanto to shift and to get into some toxic minerals that made people sick. You know, arsenic is a natural mineral. It's not a chemical compound people create. It exists naturally in the earth. There are other things that exist naturally in the earth that will make you darn sick right away and can even kill you if you drink water that's been soaking in it. When the water table shifted because of the earthquake, the wells all over the city of Kanto were poisoned and Koreans were blamed. You know, nobody said, hey, let's do a chemical analysis of the water to see what's making people sick. They said, poison must be the Koreans. We must kill them. And so LeBlanc's theories are based primarily on these two events. And by the way, it's a really weird thing. It is now the tradition in the nation of Japan that when you have an earthquake, if you see Korean people who are suffering, it is the honorable thing. It is still the Japanese tradition to help the Koreans in the neighborhood first, because Japan has not forgotten what happened as a result of the Kanto earthquake and their misunderstanding of it. Okay, here's a new theoretical concept, a new vocabulary word, mutual aid. That's what Reverend Prince was writing about and experiencing and participating in and became one of the leaders of. Mutual aid is not taxation or charity. Mutual aid is voluntary sharing among equals. Charity is something we usually give to people we do, in the social scheme of things, consider to be beneath us. If you're not homeless, when you donate to the homeless shelter, you're helping out, you're not helping out your equals. You might want to help them, but you probably wouldn't want them to move in with you because they're beneath you. And taxation, of course, that's forced charity. The government takes it away from you and you have no say. You don't have a whole lot of say in what the government uses it for either. But mutual aid is voluntary sharing among equals. And so Reverend Prince, in his early writings on the Halifax disaster, had a hard time finding other English-speaking sociologists to quote, but he found the English translation of a book by the Russian prince, Peter Kropotkin. At one point, if 15 or so of his cousins had all been assassinated at the same time, Peter Kropotkin would have been the czar of all the Russias, but that's not exactly what happened. The dynasty was about to die out with yet another revolution. And he was the author of a book called Mutual Aid. Now, he wasn't a sociologist. He's considered the father of Russian anthropology. And as a member of the royal family, Prince Peter Kropotkin joined the military and became a high-ranking officer, but he really wasn't interested in warfare and violence, and they figured he's going to be a lousy strategist. He's going to be too reluctant to sacrifice our troops. So instead, they sent him on a geological expedition into Siberia. And Peter Kropotkin lived among Siberian tribal people for a long period of time while he did the mapping. And from them, he learned the customs, their tribal customs of mutual aid. Nobody goes without, Everybody in the tribe helps one another. And the way you survive in a rough climate like Siberia, the tribal people there had way stations where they provided food, blankets, other provisions that people would need to survive the harshness of the climate in Siberia. And they just left it there for whoever came along next regularly. That's how it worked. You didn't even know who was going to come along next and use what you put out for them, but that was the custom. That was what they did. That is an example of mutual aid. And so that's the kind of thing he wrote about in his book, Mutual Aid. Coincidentally, Kropotkin is also the father of anarchist communism. And that's a 20th century movement that took stands against royalists, capitalists, Leninists. It was its own goal. It's largely died out. Nowadays, if you hear the word anarchist, you don't think of mutual aid, you think of something far more problematic. But at that time, it inspired movements. Even in our country, there were a large number of anarchists pushing leftist ideas, labor unions, and so on in this country, ideas of mutual aid. Reverend Prince used Peter Kropotkin's ideas, and he found that people in disaster had a strong preference for the freedom, creativity, and communitas. Remember, communitas is the feeling of an intense bond with your fellow human beings that people often experience in both religion and in times of disaster. So he found that people had a strong preference for that. And that's also what we found, without any theoretical labeling, in chapter 1, where the people in San Francisco preferred their own organized mutual aid to the government coming in and making people register and prove their address and stand in line, rather than the mutual aid taking place voluntarily in the form of a large party. So he also, in his writing, brought in Darwin, and social Darwinism was being strongly debated by government at the time, even as a few anarchist communists were shouting, no, we want the exact opposite. And Reverend Prince also took a stand against social Darwinism. Social Darwinism perverts Darwinism. Darwin, the son of an Anglican pastor, was utterly opposed to the complete unchristian lack of charity in social Darwinism. But let's talk about survival of the fittest. Darwin's fitness meant the best adapted to the environment. It's social Darwinism that perverts that into survival of the most violent and brutal. But social Darwinism teaches people to expect that. And that's another one of the problems of expectations in disaster. So Reverend Prince is pointing out that fitness means best adapted to the environment, and that can include the best organized, those better able to keep an entire community alive, people being protected by fellowship within one's community, wide acceptance which within one's community and one culture of social intelligence, which says, let's think this through instead of beating one another up over it. Fitness can include awareness of the needs of others, confidence that they are aware of your needs, and all of these clearly keep the human species going. So having gone through the Halifax disaster, Reverend Prince was a strong advocate for Darwin's idea of fitness rather than social Darwinism. Oops, no. I just accidentally did something. What has happened? Somebody turn on your sound and tell me, what are you getting on your screen?
Nothing, it looks normal.
Really?
Yeah, I'm seeing survival of the fittest, the same thing you did
Okay,
before.
mine just brought up a massive menu that's blotting out the entire screen. All I did was try to advance the slide. Okay, let's see if I'm able to, it's not letting me advance the slide. Okay.
There you go,
now
now you're advanced.
Yeah, now it's gone too far. Okay,
There you are.
so getting back to normal. Our author argues that our society is highly competitive, individualistic. That even makes us isolationist, and that to be good members of our culture, we have to teach our children to be that way. We make them compete for grades in school. We make them compete for sports honors. We give them competitive board games, and now we give them competitive video games. We have to teach them through school and play to be competitive. And as an anthropologist, I know for a fact that many cultures around the world, the tribal cultures, the band-based cultures, instead teach their kids to cooperate. And even though we're taught that, when disasters happen, large numbers of us, even in our society, will revert back to the more natural mutual aid reaction once the system that requires us to be competitive is temporarily out of the way. And Prince, in his writings on the Halifax disaster, was one of the first theorists to suggest this in the English language, on top of the English language translations of Peter Kropotkin's writings. So our author for Paradise Built in Hell is pointing out that we are heroic helpers mainly only when the powers that be get out of the way. And that mainly only happens in a modern, advanced, industrial, capitalist culture like ours, mostly only happens in disasters. Which is why disasters become peak experiences for people rather than, oh my God, it was horrible. It often becomes a high point of people's lives. So then this chapter moves on, because it's still trying to make this theoretical point. It moves on to lessons from numerous British studies of the London Blitz and an American researcher building on the British studies of the London Blitz. After the war, America sent Charles Fritz to interview Germans to see if their experience of the war and being bombed and having entire cities destroyed and surviving the destruction of entire cities like the British were doing. For example, the destruction of Coventry, almost the entire city was gone after the Germans bombed it. Charles Fritz was sent by the Americans to see if the other side of the war had experienced it the same way. I'm also simultaneously, I'm currently reading, it comes out backwards, The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. It's about, well, as it says, the saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. So it's a book about the Blitzkrieg in England. And it also shows amazingly how well studied the British really wanted to know what the citizens were experiencing during the Blitzkrieg. And they recruited a bunch of diarists to write it all down. You know, if you have to run out of your home to go to a shelter, make sure you take your diaries and turn them into the government periodically, so we know what hundreds of citizens in every city are experiencing. Tell us what you do, tell us what you feel, tell us what you experience. We have really detailed research on the Blitzkrieg. And so what they found was that people preferred to wait out the bombings in large shelters rather than in individual family shelters. A lot of people did what the government told them. They dug a shelter in their backyard. They built it to the specifications of the government, would not have survived a direct hit, but then neither did the subways where most of the people preferred to go. They gathered underground in huge groups. Despite the fact that there were horrendous sanitation problems, the entire population of London living underground for 8 to 12 hours a day, there weren't enough restrooms in the subway system for all those people. And yet, even with the smell and with the possibility of outbreaks of things like cholera, which did not in fact break out, people preferred to gather in huge numbers, where they did things like spend hours and hours singing patriotic songs until nobody's throat could handle another note all night long. You didn't sleep a lot in the subways all night long. You communed with one another. You raised feelings of communitas. And among the findings were that in the heavily bombed cities where people shared the suffering and the mitigating actions and the recovery with one another, had better morale than the people waiting in isolated homes in cities that were never hit. They were losing it. They were miserable. They were terrified. People who were actually being bombed night after night after night for years until finally their home and their neighborhood were gone, had better morale, had better mental health than people waiting it out alone or in the small group of a family. Communitas, that feeling of fellowship generated by disasters, really matters. In fact, research done in the United States after the September 11th attacks showed that people in New York City who experienced the horrific disaster, many of them had lost loved ones or at least co-workers, but they also experienced the intense communitas. A lot of people in New York City had better mental health than people in the middle of the country who were just worried, literally sick by the events of September 11th. What if it happens here can cause more harm than it actually happening and being allowed to take appropriate action? Wow. Another thing that was discovered is that loss of possessions and things to worry about can be very liberating. And people can go, oh, you almost always on the Weather Channel, people being interviewed after the hurricane, after the flood, after the tornado, people standing in the ruins of their home, they almost always say something like, it's only material possessions. Every member of the family got out okay, and they're hugging their kids, and they're hugging their spouse, they're hugging their brother who drove across town to see if they were okay. And they're almost always saying, people are the important things, and we've still got one another. And it can actually be liberating to lose all the stuff that you have to take care of and worry about losing on a daily basis. So one of, which researcher? Go back in my head. Okay, one of the students of the last researcher was Enrico Carantelli. And he was actually still around when I got into the disaster field. So I got to see some of his very last research presented by him. He studied the expectation of panic in 1953, the expectation of panic in 1953. He did historical research to discover, he was looking for panic because panic was still theoretically expected. Not only panic, but violence against your fellow survivors was supposed to be the form that the panic took. And his conclusion, after studying the historical record of every disaster he could get his hands on, was that people almost never do panic and turn on one another. There are particular conditions that will bring that about, but they're extremely rare. However, to this day, politicians and law enforcement ignored him. We've known this in sociology, anthropology. We've known this in the social sciences since 1953. But politicians and law enforcement continue to ignore that. Hollywood, when they do disaster pictures, and fiction authors continue to ignore him. News media still frame most disaster reporting to seek out looting and panic. And a major reason for that is, even though most major media outlets still hire people such as fashion consultants, even though they know that people buy newspapers and turn on the television when there's a disaster because people want news about it, not one major news network has a trained or experienced disaster specialist on staff. Oh, well. Carantelli went on to found America's first scholarly disaster centers at major universities. Not just one, but several. He'd found it, he'd stay there for a few years, then a bigger university would offer him more money and say something like, we'll let you hire a staff, we'll let you found a department, we'll give you $1 million to start out for your first research, and then, we promise $5 million by the second year. He traveled all over the place, founding major disaster studies centers, and they still don't hire anyone who graduates from them in the mass media. Scholars continue to find that citizen panic only happens in certain rare conditions. And we're going to study that. When does that actually happen? We get together next time. But one of his students was Kathleen Tierney. And she took the idea that not only do citizens rarely panic and turn on one another, but elites placed in charge of disaster often do. There's a pattern. You might notice some of this could apply to the current pandemic. The leaders are more interested in hoarding their power than in dealing with rescuing people, providing relief, providing provisions, organizing the response, and preventing the next one. So they withhold information. They divide victims from one another by doing things such as passing curfew or cordoning off areas that have been damaged so that people can't help one another, can't travel back and forth to find loved ones, can't bring aid that's being donated by their fellow disaster victims. Elites tend to distrust citizens, and control of those citizens is often deemed much more important than mitigation or aid or getting people relief, getting help in. They not only distrust ordinary citizens, red middle-class white people, but leaders often have outright fear of minorities and the poor. And among some of them, it's really obvious, and they know they're racist, although they tried to cover it up to get elected. But even with leaders who don't think they're racist, there is something called latent racism, where it's unconscious. And people who would never be afraid of a Black person sitting down at the next table having lunch next to them, or a Black person getting elected to the same city council, they're in fact in favor of that. But when they see impoverished Black people and no way to get the police there to control those impoverished Black people, their unconscious racism often comes out. They often withhold essential resources until citizens exhibit submissiveness, such as registering for assistance or getting in line or proving their address or some other sign of submission. You have to evacuate now. We're not going to let you stay and dig out your own loved ones. Elites often value property over human lives and well-being. Oh my God, look at the luxury hotel. We've got to knock down the small residences and use them as a fire break. Even though people are still in those small residences, we've got to knock them down and protect the luxury hotel. Often value property over human lives. They often trust rumors that validate their other prejudices. Oh, I just knew that poor Black people were a danger to themselves and others. I've heard a rumor that they are looting, and I'm going to believe that rumor without really good evidence. And leaders often tend to believe the rumors that validate their prejudices rather than trusting all of those thousands, tens of thousands, possibly even 100,000 people who have been through the courses at the universities with disaster response programs, or trusting people who have been through years of disasters and have experience responding. Rather than listening to them, they're likely to listen to the rumors. our next chapter that I'm going to assign, we're going to skip a couple. We're going to read about Katrina, and Katrina is full of all of these things. And so elite panic tends to create a feedback loop of results. They use precious rare resources to punish the hypersociality that comes with communitas and altruism. They don't understand mutual aid. They're trying to control the people, and that means stopping them from doing anything, including helping one another. That means that once they're out to round them up and get them under control, they're likely to abuse the citizens. We're going to read about more people getting shot by law enforcement in our next disaster. They might even want to withhold information about what's going on and keep them in the dark. If people don't know what's going on, they won't be able to make decisions for themselves. Of course, that's likely to put them in harm's way, but it's also a little more likely to keep them under control. Until finally, the general public can be driven by all of these actions to acts of desperation and antisocial behavior. When they're on their third day of going without water, their dehydrated brains are not functioning at an optimal level, and they're becoming desperate, especially after they've witnessed a few of the survivors may be injured or vulnerable, beginning to die. They're going to blame the people that rounded them up and ordered them to do nothing and shot some of them when they tried to get supplies. And then they become antisocial. This then justifies more violence from above. And when you've got that, then the people might intentionally rebel. We're going to see all of this when we read about Katrina, caused by the elite panic. So, since we're in the middle of a pandemic, this chapter 2 in Paradise Built in Hell, uses the example of epidemics. That means the whole world wasn't involved, but local areas, everybody in those local areas was at risk in these two epidemics. And for comparison, Milwaukee, 1894, we had smallpox vaccine by then. It was developed. It was one of the first ones that was developed. In Milwaukee in 1894, the elites panic. The wealthy were allowed to self-quarantine. They were allowed to go home, infect their families, infect their servants. Their servants then took it home to the poor neighborhoods, but the poor were treated completely differently, and they were forcibly removed to so-called emergency hospitals with poor food, very little medical care, and people were essentially locked into large rooms surrounded by the dying. Word about these places got out, and so the poor hid infections. The rich were infecting one another and the poor were being rounded up, and the poor were infecting one another because they were hiding infections. People tried to care for family members rather than going to a doctor. Then the military came in with forced inoculations. This is very early in the development of inoculation. They had valid, very effective shots for smallpox, but people didn't understand them. There was no effort to educate the public about them. In Milwaukee in 1894, that smallpox epidemic had a very high death toll. No kidding. And a lot of people scarred for life because smallpox, the pox, don't go away. They leave scars all over people's bodies for the rest of their lives, and other impaired organ functions as well, even if they did survive it. New York City, 1947, the elites stayed cool. Maybe they were beginning to listen to the sociologists. They organized popular advertising education campaigns and press conferences. They put stories in the newspaper where popular musicians, popular lecturers, people the common people recognized and liked were rounded up to be involved in this popular education campaign. And local doctors and local leaders, they went to local church leaders. Right now in New York City is starting to see spikes again in some of the ethnic neighborhoods, particularly the Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, where the religious leaders don't trust the government and the health department, and they're telling people not to bother wearing masks, keep coming to your religious gatherings, don't follow the rules for how many people are allowed in the room. They're not doing enough to invite those people to meetings, get their feedback, respect their difference, respect their desire to remain the leaders over their own people. And yet, by honoring their leadership, by honoring their local subculture, get them to change one little thing. But they pulled it off perfectly in 1947 by working with the local leaders for all of the melting pot that New York City has always been. They approached all of the different ethnic groups, all of the different religious groups, and they brought in doctors and nurses to talk with the religious leaders, convinced everybody to go along with it. The only people who were forcibly held were people caught price gouging, trying to charge too much for the vaccines. By publicly advertising the fact that they were being arrested, that made the health departments even more popular. Oh, look, the government is protecting us from these people that we don't trust anyway. Vaccines were manufactured cheaply, provided to the people by the government, and it had a very low death toll. Same disease, completely different response. Elite panic can make a major difference. And so that's it. I'm gonna try and get back to stop sharing, get back images of everybody attending, and open it up. Get rid of your self-mute. And is there any discussion? Any questions? Any input this time? Any argument? Well, if there isn't, is that Tony waving a hand or?
Oh, I just
Okay.
want to let you know, I like the book a lot. Thank you.
Okay, great. At our last meeting, you hadn't gotten it yet, so now you're into it and you like it.
Yeah.
Good. Good. Yes,
Linda?
Cheryl.
The Watauga Public Library's Cook the Books Book Club book this month is called The Library Book. And it's about the Los Angeles Public Library fire in 1986. And there's a several chapters in there. It's kind of cut up, the story, but there's several places in there where she talks about the 400 or so employees coming out onto the street and the sadness and the tears and, you know, watching the library go up in flames. To 200 and some odd thousand books were destroyed and 700,000 books were seriously damaged, and all kinds of collections, patent collections and things like that. And then there was this woman from out of town who was present, who was a paper conservator. And she was there at the fire, and she said, we've got to get these 700,000 books out of this library and into freezers within 72 hours.
Uh-huh.
And so the library, and I guess the town of Los Angeles, sent out this call for volunteers. So it's interesting in that, you know, it's another disaster that people can read about if they're interested. They can just go to the public library and ask for the library book. You don't have to be a member of the club to get it.
I actually just joined the club, so I will be getting it. Yeah. I've also recently read a book called The Kick-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu. And in that particular book, these are ancient scrolls. In some cases, it's the only copy of early Islamic scholarship, including all of that early Islamic science that was going on. You know, they call them Arabic numerals because they were brought to the West by the Arabs. And some of these ancient scrolls were kept in Timbuktu, preserved by the desert climate and this Islamic library. Well, when they got invaded by the local Islamic religious fanatics, they set out to destroy those ancient scrolls because they often, well, they included scientific scrolls, they included religious argument that Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and the other religious crazies, it wasn't their version of Islam. And so this book is about the people who risked their lives to adopt those library books and hide them from the religious fanatics in Timbuktu. Yeah, libraries tend to bring out the best in people, I think. And the worst when people are trying to destroy them. Yeah. Okay, so anybody else? Okay, next week, our reading is going to be the chapter in A Paradise Built in Hell. Pulling it off the shelf. I'm sitting at a nice big secretary that has bookshelves above it. So let's see. You're going to skip the next chapter and you're going to read chapter 5, New Orleans, Common Grounds and Killers. So read chapter 5. We're going to be reading about Katrina, reading about New Orleans. And I will also get that out to everybody. Now, I had one new person who joined recently whose email I got wrong and it came back to me. See where I wrote that down. I'm going to have to I'm going to have to
I
trace
got it
their.
too.
Oh, you got it too?
Yeah, let me see if I can find it.
Okay. I don't see that person here among us anyway.
It was something like AB.
Yeah, and it was an att.net.
Okay, I could just send an email out again and it would pop right back to me.
Well, I don't think it's any of the people
Okay,
that are
right,
here.
right.
So, yeah, okay. So, see you all next week and keep reading. Those of you who are reading, keep watching our own rapidly unrolling pandemic and stay safe.
Also, I did recurring meeting this time, so I think this same link
Ah,
will
okay,
get you for all the next 3 meetings.
excellent.
Good.
And we've got a talk coming up on the 21st in the morning on genealogy for beginners.
Ah. Okay, goodbye all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, I think this meeting link will be good for the rest of the time.
I have a new idea about where your invitations might be going to.
Oh,
Even though I'm getting bulk emails from the phone banks for the Democrats that I'm doing, somehow yours, there are some weird things where, like when Belk department store sends me junk mail, that doesn't go to junk, it goes to, there are weird categories that Google has created where I need to search those. I thought of that last night and I didn't have time to look, especially with my computer malfunctioning today. But maybe they're winding up in there for some bizarre reason. Maybe they think you're a department store.
uh-huh. I double checked and
know.
your address is, I got rid of the ASU one. And I got rid of the library address.
Yeah, okay, good.
And it's just the one that I've been using it. And it even said,
LindaJJanet@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But I'm gonna search in those other places where things get sent that I never look at and see if you're in there with the department stores.
okay. All right. Well, see you next week.
Okay.
Bye.